At the party, my sister-in-law slapped me. Get out. My husband sat silently. I left for good. A month later, she lost the estate and begged for help. I replied, "You reap what you sow. My name is Valerie, and I am 34 years old. I work as a certified public accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown. For the past 4 years, I have been living in a tiny, converted garage that we loosely call a guest house. This cramped little box sits in the expansive backyard of a massive, multi-million-dollar luxury estate. The estate supposedly belongs to my 38-year-old brother, Preston, and his 35-year-old wife, Cassandra. If you were to drive past the property, you would see a perfectly manicured lawn, a circular driveway, and usually a luxury sports car parked right out front. If you were to look at Cassandra's social media pages, you would be absolutely convinced that they are self-made millionaires living the ultimate American dream. She posts daily pictures of herself lounging by the custom infinity pool. She is always wearing designer clothes and holding a glass of expensive champagne. Preston walks around in tailored suits, calling himself a visionary entrepreneur. He loves to host weekend barbecues where he brags to his friends about his latest supposed business acquisitions. My husband, Derek, who is 36 years old, and I are allowed to attend these gatherings, but only if we stay in the background. We are introduced to their friends as the humble family members who rent the little guest house out back. Everyone thinks Preston is incredibly generous for letting his little sister live on his magnificent property. People constantly pull me aside at these parties to tell me how lucky I am to have such a successful and caring older brother. I always just force a polite smile, nod my head, and excuse myself to go wash their dirty dishes in the kitchen. Because the truth is, the entire narrative is a carefully constructed lie. Preston and Cassandra are not millionaires, and they certainly are not self-made. That sprawling estate, the infinity pool, the custom kitchen with marble countertops, it is all legally tied to my name. For years ago, I used my life savings for the massive down payment on that house. I put my flawless credit score on the line to act as the primary guarantor for the mortgage. Every single month, I transfer thousands of dollars into an account that automatically pays their property taxes, their homeowner's insurance, and the bulk of their mortgage. The rent that Derek and I supposedly pay to live in a glorified tool shed does not go into Preston's pocket. It goes directly to the bank to keep a roof over his head. I am the invisible backbone of their entire lavish existence. I am the one working 60-hour weeks during tax season to make sure their checks do not bounce. I sacrifice my own comfort, my own vacations, and my own future to maintain their fragile illusion of wealth. And as I sat in my tiny, drafty guest house night after night, crunching numbers on my laptop, I started to realize something terrifying. The financial hole they were digging was getting deeper, and they were dragging me down with them. You are probably wondering why a supposedly smart accountant would ever agree to such a terrible financial arrangement. To understand that, you have to understand the toxic dynamic of my family. My parents, Barbara and Richard, are in their 60s and are comfortably retired. Ever since we were little kids, Preston was the golden child of the family. He was the handsome, charismatic firstborn son who could do absolutely no wrong in their eyes. I was just the quiet, studious younger sister who was expected to clean up his messes. When Preston was 25, he decided he wanted to open a high-end restaurant without knowing the first thing about the hospitality industry. My parents mortgaged their own house to give him the startup capital. The restaurant went bankrupt in less than 18 months, leaving my parents drowning in debt. Instead of holding him accountable, my parents blamed the economy and praised Preston for having an entrepreneurial spirit. 3 years later, he started a tech company that supposedly created an app for fitness tracking. He convinced all our relatives to invest, promising them massive returns within a year. That company folded too, and all the investment money simply vanished. Preston never apologized. He just shrugged it off and said he was ahead of his time. Then, 4 years ago, he met Cassandra, a woman whose ambition matched his ego. They wanted to get married and buy the biggest house in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. Of course, with his history of bankruptcies and terrible credit, no bank would even let him through the front door. That is when my parents turned their sights on me. I had just gotten my CPA license, I had zero debt, and I had been saving aggressively since college. My mother called me crying every single day for weeks. She told me that Preston had finally found the love of his life and was ready to settle down. She said that if he did not get this house, Cassandra might leave him, and it would destroy him. My father sat me down and told me that family always protects family. They guilt-tripped me, manipulated me, and wore me down until I finally broke. They convinced me that this time was different, that Preston had a steady executive job and would pay me back every dime. So, I signed the papers. I drained my savings account for the down payment and tied my financial identity to his mortgage. I genuinely believed I was doing a noble thing by helping my brother build his life. But within 6 months, Preston quit his executive job because he said his boss did not respect his creative vision. He decided he was going to be a full-time independent consultant. His income immediately dropped to almost zero, but Cassandra's spending habits somehow doubled. That is when the panicked phone calls started. Preston would call me the day before the mortgage was due, begging me to cover the shortfall just for 1 month. 1 month turned into 2, 2 turned into 6, and suddenly, it became the new normal. I became his permanent safety net, funding a lifestyle I could never even afford for myself. The heaviest burden I carried was not just the financial strain, but the absolute isolation. I was married to Derek, a man who was supposed to be my partner and protector. Derek is a middle manager at a logistics company, and he is terrified of conflict. He is the kind of guy who will eat a completely raw steak at a restaurant just to avoid bothering the waiter. When we first moved into the guest house to keep an eye on the property and help Preston save money, Derek thought it was a great idea. He loved the idea of living on a huge estate, even if we were crammed into the back corner. He loved playing golf with Preston and drinking expensive whiskey on the patio on weekends. But as the years went by and the financial truth became impossible to ignore, Derek chose willful ignorance. Every time I showed him our bank statements, showing how our savings were bleeding out to cover Preston's mortgage, Derek would just sigh. He would run his hands through his hair and tell me that it was just money. He constantly told me that we needed to look at the bigger picture and keep the peace in the family. One evening, about a year ago, I reached my breaking point. I discovered that Preston had used the house as collateral to take out a high-interest hard money loan without telling me. I was furious and terrified because it put the entire property and my credit at massive risk. I showed the documents to Derek, expecting him to finally get angry and stand by my side. Instead, Derek just looked at the papers, poured himself a beer, and told me to calm down. He said that Preston was a smart guy and probably had a plan to pay it all back. He actually looked me in the eye and said I was being too dramatic and that I needed to stop acting like a victim. That night, something inside me permanently shifted. I realized I was completely alone in this marriage. Derek was not my teammate. He was just another weight holding me underwater. I stopped arguing with him after that day. I stopped asking him for support or sharing my financial anxieties with him. Instead, I poured all of my energy into a massive, hidden Google spreadsheet. I named the file the exit strategy. In that spreadsheet, I meticulously tracked every single dollar I had ever spent on that house. I tracked the down payment, the monthly mortgage contributions, the property taxes, and the emergency repairs. I tracked the interest rates, the hard money loans, and the exact dates they were taken out. I built complex formulas to calculate exactly how fast Preston and Cassandra were burning through cash. I was not just keeping a record, I was building a bomb. And as I watched the numbers turn red and the debt multiply, I knew the explosion was only a matter of time. Living feet away from Cassandra was like living with a tyrannical queen who constantly forgot you were the one paying for her crown. Cassandra fancied herself a prominent lifestyle influencer, though her following was mostly bought and paid for. Her entire existence revolved around aesthetics and projecting an image of effortless superiority. Because Derek and I lived in the guest house, she treated us like the live-in help. It started with small things, like texting me to grab her packages from the front porch because she did not want to put on makeup. Then it escalated to her demanding I let the pool cleaners in, supervise the landscapers, and sign for her endless deliveries of designer shoes. She would text me in the middle of my workday, demanding I come home immediately to let the dog walker inside. If I told her I was busy with client meetings and could not leave the office, she would throw a tantrum. She would complain to Preston, who would then call my parents, who would then call me to lecture me about being unsupportive. Cassandra never once thanked me for anything I did. She genuinely believed that allowing me to live in the guest house was a massive favor she was doing for me. She would often make passive-aggressive comments about my clothes or my car in front of her friends. She would look at my simple work suits and laugh, saying she could never imagine living such a boring, restricted life. She told her friends that Derek and I were saving up to buy a starter home in a cheap neighborhood. I had to stand there, biting my tongue until it bled, knowing that my money was the only reason she was not living in a trailer park. One Saturday afternoon, she hosted a lavish garden party for 20 other local influencers. She texted me at 6 in the morning, ordering me to come to the main house and help set up the catering tables. I spent 4 hours arranging flowers and polishing silverware while she got her hair and makeup done. When the guests started arriving, she literally shooed me away with her hand, telling me to go back to the guest house so I would not ruin the aesthetic of her photos. I walked back to my tiny, cramped living room, sat on my cheap sofa, and opened my laptop. I pulled up my spreadsheet and logged the catering company she had used. I cross-referenced it with the credit card statements that were mailed to my name. She had spent $4,000 on tiny sandwiches and cheap champagne, putting it on a card that was already maxed out. I watched her through the window, laughing and posing for photos by the pool. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt cold and calculating. I knew that her entire world was a house of cards, and I was the only thing stopping the wind from blowing it down. In my profession as an accountant, there is a concept we call the ratchet effect. It is a behavioral economic theory that explains why it is incredibly easy for people to increase their standard of living, but psychologically devastating for them to decrease it. Once someone gets used to flying first class, sitting in economy feels like a violation of their human rights. Preston and Cassandra were the ultimate textbook examples of the ratchet effect. Over the past 2 years, as Preston's consulting business failed to bring in any real revenue, they should have cut back. They should have sold the luxury cars, stopped the pool maintenance, and cooked their own meals. Instead, they did the exact opposite. They doubled down on the illusion, convinced that projecting wealth would eventually attract real wealth. Since they could not get traditional bank loans because of their terrible debt-to-income ratio, Preston turned to the dark side of finance. He started taking out hard money loans from private lenders. These are short-term, extremely high-interest loans secured against the equity of the property. He was borrowing money at 15 or 20% interest just to pay off the minimum balances on his credit cards. It was financial suicide, and because my name was on the primary deed as a cosigner, he was dragging my credit score into the grave with him. I tracked every single one of these toxic loans in my master spreadsheet. I watched the equity of the massive estate evaporate month by month. I knew exactly what their total monthly burn rate was, and it was horrifying. Between the mortgage, the property taxes, the luxury car leases, the hard money loan interest, and Cassandra's shopping habits, they were burning through roughly $20,000 every single month. Their actual legitimate income was maybe $4,000 a month. I was covering about $6,000 a month just to keep the bank from foreclosing. The rest was pure, unsustainable debt. I spent weeks analyzing the numbers, running different projections and stress tests on their finances. My mathematical conclusion was absolute and undeniable. They had completely run out of runway. The credit cards were maxed out, the private lenders were not extending any more credit, and the equity was gone. The only liquid cash keeping the entire operation afloat was the auto draft from my personal checking account. If I turned off that auto draft, they would not survive a single billing cycle. The cars would be repossessed in a matter of weeks. The utility companies would shut off the power to the estate. The bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings within 90 days. I stared at the glowing numbers on my screen late one night, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. The power dynamic had completely shifted without them even realizing it. I was no longer the victim trapped in their web of debt. I was the one holding the scissors, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to cut the strings. The perfect moment arrived sooner than I expected, disguised as an invitation to a family dinner. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Cassandra sent a group text to me, Derek, my parents, and a few close relatives. She announced that they were hosting a formal dinner party on Friday night to celebrate Preston's latest business milestone. She claimed Preston had just closed a massive consulting deal and had leased a brand new, custom sports car to celebrate. I pulled up the joint bank account statements online immediately. There was no massive consulting deal. Preston had simply drained the last remaining drops of a high-interest personal loan to make the massive down payment on the lease. The text message ended with a direct order to me. Cassandra told me that since she was busy coordinating with the caterers, I needed to come over on Thursday night to deep clean the guest bathrooms and polish the dining room table. I showed the text message to Derek, who was sitting on the couch watching television. I asked him if he thought it was appropriate for his sister-in-law to order me to scrub her toilets for a party celebrating a car bought with debt I would eventually have to pay for. Derek did not even look away from the television screen. He just sighed heavily and said it was easier to just do what she asked. He told me not to make a big deal out of it and to just keep the peace for the weekend. I looked at the side of his face for a long moment, realizing how truly useless he was. I did not argue with him. I just walked into the bedroom, packed a small overnight bag, and hid it in the trunk of my car. I did not go over to the main house on Thursday night. I ignored Cassandra's frantic text messages and phone calls demanding to know where I was. I sat in the dark guest house, reviewing my spreadsheet one final time, making sure every calculation was perfect. On Friday evening, the night of the dinner, I put on a simple, elegant black dress. Derek wore a suit and nervously asked me why I had not gone over early to help Cassandra. I just smiled coldly and told him I decided I wanted to be a guest for once. We walked across the perfectly manicured lawn toward the massive front doors of the estate. I could hear the loud music and the sound of people laughing and clinking glasses inside. I could see the gleaming silver sports car parked in the driveway, reflecting the warm patio lights. It looked like a scene from a movie about wealthy, successful people. But I knew the truth. I knew that the car was a rented prop, the house was a sinking ship, and the people inside were drowning in a sea of lies. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart rate slow down until it was completely steady. I opened the front door and stepped into the light, ready to burn the entire illusion to the ground. If you are enjoying this story so far, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment below with the name of the city you are living in right now. Every single comment helps the video reach more people, so thank you so much for your support. The atmosphere inside the estate was suffocatingly pretentious. Cassandra had hired a private chef to prepare a 5-course meal, and there were 2 waiters walking around serving vintage wine. My parents were sitting in the living room, beaming with pride as Preston showed off the keys to his new sports car to an uncle. When Cassandra saw me walk in, her eyes narrowed into angry little slits. She immediately marched over to me, grabbed my arm, and pulled me into the hallway away from the guests. She hissed at me, demanding to know why I had ignored her texts and why the guest bathrooms were not perfectly spotless. She told me I was incredibly selfish and ungrateful for ruining her perfect evening. I calmly removed her hand from my arm, looked her dead in the eye, and told her I was off the clock. I walked away, leaving her standing there with her mouth hanging open in shock. I walked into the dining room and took a seat at the very far end of the massive oak table. Derek quickly scurried over and sat next to me, looking terrified and constantly checking his phone. The guests eventually moved into the dining room, laughing loudly and complimenting Cassandra on the beautiful table setting. My mother sat next to Preston, patting his hand and loudly declaring that she always knew he would be incredibly successful. My father raised a glass of wine and toasted to Preston's brilliant business mind. I sat there in silence, taking small bites of my food and watching the performance play out. It was like watching a play where I was the only person in the audience who knew the actors were broke. I calculated the cost of the meal in my head as the courses came out. The private chef, the waitstaff, the imported Wagyu beef, the vintage wine. It was easily a $3,000 dinner, all charged to a credit card that was tied to my social security number. I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over me, not from the food, but from the sheer audacity of their delusion. They were literally eating my future, swallowing my hard work and my sacrifices, and praising Preston for the taste. I looked at Derek, hoping to see a shred of realization or discomfort in his eyes. But he was too busy laughing at a terrible joke my uncle made, desperate to fit in with the crowd. The dinner dragged on for 2 agonizing hours of fake smiles and empty bragging. I drank water, kept my mouth shut, and waited for the inevitable moment when the bill would come due. Because with Preston, there was always an ulterior motive for throwing a party. He never spent money without expecting to extract more money from someone else. And as dessert was being served, I saw him subtly loosen his tie and clear his throat. The room slowly quieted down as people turned their attention to the head of the table. Preston stood up slowly, holding a half-empty glass of expensive red wine. He tapped his knife against the side of the glass, the sharp ringing sound echoing through the dining room. Everyone fell completely silent, turning their faces toward him with eager anticipation. He smiled, displaying his perfectly whitened teeth, and began a long, rambling speech. He talked about the importance of family, the value of hard work, and the sacrifices required to build a legacy. He thanked our parents for their unwavering support and praised Cassandra for being his rock. Then his tone suddenly shifted, becoming serious and slightly aggressive. He started talking about the rising costs of maintaining such a magnificent estate in today's economy. He complained about property taxes, insurance premiums, and the general cost of living. My parents nodded sympathetically, murmuring their agreement about how hard things were. Then, Preston turned his gaze directly toward the far end of the table, locking eyes with me. He said that because family supports family, everyone needed to carry their fair share of the burden. He announced to the entire room that Derek and I had been living in the guest house for practically nothing for years. He stated that he had been subsidizing our lives out of the goodness of his heart, but things had to change. He took a sip of his wine, slammed the glass down on the table, and delivered the ultimatum. He looked right at me and said that due to the increased maintenance costs, my monthly contribution needed to increase significantly. He did not call it a mortgage payment. He deliberately called it rent, to humiliate me in front of the guests. He puffed out his chest and declared loudly, "The rent is now $12,500. A heavy, uncomfortable silence dropped over the dining room like a lead weight. Even my parents looked slightly taken aback by the massive number. $12,500 a month was an absurd, astronomical amount of money. It was more than my entire monthly salary, and it was deliberately designed to break me. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at me with a smug, challenging expression. He finished his declaration with the final, fatal words, "Don't like it? Move out." He expected me to cry, to beg, or to humiliate myself by negotiating in front of the entire family. He expected Derek to step in and grovel on our behalf. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clear focus. I slowly placed my linen napkin on the table and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I looked back at him, my voice perfectly level and calm, carrying clearly through the silent room. I said, "Preston, we both know I don't pay rent. I pay the mortgage on a house that you cannot afford." The entire table gasped collectively, the air sucking out of the room in an instant. The moment the words left my mouth, the illusion shattered into a million sharp pieces. My mother let out a loud gasp and covered her mouth with her hands. My father's face turned bright red, and he started to stand up, but shock kept him glued to his chair. Preston's smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked terror. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin a lie, to call me crazy, but no words came out. He knew that I knew the exact numbers, and he was completely exposed in front of his friends. But before Preston could formulate a response, Cassandra exploded. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. I had just humiliated her in front of the very people she spent all her time trying to impress. She shoved her chair back so violently it crashed to the floor, and she marched down the length of the table toward me. She did not yell or scream at first. She moved with terrifying, silent speed. Before I could even react, she reached me, raised her hand, and slapped me across the face with everything she had. The sound of the slap cracked through the silent dining room like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side, and a sharp, burning pain flared across my cheek. I tasted the metallic tang of blood in my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. Cassandra stood over me, her chest heaving, pointing a shaking finger at my face. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and hysterical. "How dare you disrespect us in our home? Get out of my house." I slowly turned my head back, ignoring the stinging pain, and looked directly at Derek. This was the defining moment of our entire marriage. His wife had just been physically assaulted by his sister-in-law in front of a room full of people over a financial lie. I waited for him to stand up, to shout, to push her away, to do absolutely anything. I waited for the man I married to show a single ounce of courage. Derek looked at my red, stinging cheek, and then he looked up at the furious faces of Preston and Cassandra. He looked at my parents, who were staring in stunned silence. And then, Derek did the most cowardly thing I have ever witnessed in my life. He slowly lowered his head, picked up his fork, and stared blankly down at his plate of cold Wagyu beef. He said absolutely nothing. He did not move a muscle. In that exact second, the remaining love I had for him evaporated completely. He was not a husband. He was a hostage who had fallen in love with his captors. I did not cry, and I did not scream back at Cassandra. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair in neatly beneath the table. I picked up my purse, turned my back on the entire room, and walked toward the front door. I did not look back at my parents, I did not look back at Preston, and I certainly did not look back at Derek. I walked out of the heavy wooden front doors and stepped into the cool, quiet night air. The loud music and the screaming inside felt like they were a million miles away. The pain in my cheek was sharp, but my mind was clearer than it had been in 4 long years. I walked across the dark lawn toward the guest house, ready to execute the exit strategy one had spent years perfecting. I walked back to the guest house in the dark, my footsteps silent on the perfectly manicured grass. The cool night air felt incredibly refreshing against my burning cheek. Behind me, the main estate was still buzzing with the sounds of the dinner party, the muffled music and loud voices completely ignorant of the bomb that had just been detonated in the dining room. I unlocked the flimsy door of our guest house and stepped inside. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I only switched on the small desk lamp in the corner, casting long, quiet shadows across the cramped living room. I expected to feel a rush of overwhelming emotion. I expected the tears to finally come, or to feel a paralyzing sense of panic about what I was about to do. But as I stood there in the dim light, I felt absolutely nothing of the sort. My heart rate was completely normal. My breathing was slow and steady. The terrified, obedient little sister was gone, and the humiliated wife had vanished right along with her. In their place was the certified public accountant, and I was looking at my life the exact same way I looked at a severely compromised corporate ledger. It was time to liquidate the bad assets and close the account. I pulled my sturdy black suitcase from the top shelf of the closet and laid it flat on the bed. I did not pack randomly or frantically. I moved with absolute, methodical precision, prioritizing the items with the highest operational value. I went straight to the small fireproof safe hidden under the desk and entered the combination. I pulled out my birth certificate, my passport, my social security card, and a thick folder containing the last 7 years of my tax returns. I took the physical security tokens for my bank accounts and the master external hard drive that contained the backup of my exit strategy spreadsheet. I placed all of these documents into a waterproof sleeve and tucked them into the bottom of the suitcase. Next came my professional life. I packed my work laptop, my chargers, and exactly 5 tailored business suits, 5 silk blouses, and 2 pairs of sensible black heels. I packed enough basic toiletries to survive in a hotel for a week. That was it. I did not pack the expensive, flashy jewelry Derek had bought me over the years to apologize for his constant cowardice. I did not pack the casual clothes I wore when Cassandra ordered me to do her gardening. I did not pack a single photograph, not of my wedding day, not of my parents, and certainly not of my brother. Every single item I left behind was a physical representation of the life I was severing. The heavy silence of the guest house was my only companion as I zipped the suitcase shut. It took me exactly 45 minutes to condense my entire 34 years of existence into one wheeled bag and a laptop backpack. I sat down on the edge of the bed and waited. I knew Derek would eventually have to come back. He would not be able to stay in the main house forever, pretending everything was fine while his wife was missing. I used the time to log into my mobile banking app and take one final look at the current balances. The joint account I shared with Derek had about $4,000 in it. The primary checking account that funded Preston's entire fraudulent life had $22,000 in it, money I had been saving to cover his impending property tax bill. I stared at those numbers, realizing that with a few clicks of a button, I could bring a multi-million-dollar illusion crashing down to the dirt. I did not make the transfers yet. I needed to wait until I was safely off the property and secure in a new location. I simply locked my phone, slipped it into my pocket, and listened to the sound of crickets outside the window. The stinging sensation on my left cheek had faded into a dull, throbbing ache, serving as a constant, physical reminder of exactly why I was leaving. Cassandra's slap had not just bruised my face, it had shattered the final invisible chain of guilt that kept me tied to my family. By striking me, she had completely absolved me of any moral obligation I felt to protect them. I was completely free, and the only thing left to do was hand my cowardly husband his final notice. About an hour after I had walked out of the dining room, the front door of the guest house finally opened. Derek stumbled inside, his face flushed red and his tie loosened around his neck. The heavy stench of expensive red wine and nervous sweat rolled off him in waves, filling the small room. He closed the door, leaned against it for a second, and let out a long, exaggerated sigh, as if he were the one who had just endured a traumatic event. He did not look at my face. He did not ask me if I was in pain, if I was okay, or if I needed an ice pack for my cheek. Instead, he looked at my packed suitcase sitting by the door, and then he looked at me sitting calmly on the edge of the bed. He ran both of his hands through his hair, a gesture of deep frustration, and started pacing back and forth across the cheap carpet. "What on earth were you thinking, Valerie?" he muttered, his voice thick with annoyance rather than concern. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for me? Sitting there while my wife acts like a crazy person in front of Preston's business partners." I did not interrupt him. I just let him talk, recording every pathetic word in my memory. "You completely ruined the celebration," Derek continued, throwing his hands up in the air. "Preston is furious. He said you humiliated him on purpose because you are jealous of his success. And Cassandra is upstairs crying because you made her lose her temper." He stopped pacing and pointed a finger at me, adopting the tone of a disappointed parent. "You need to unpack that bag right now. We are going to go over there tomorrow morning, and you are going to apologize to both of them. You are going to tell them you were stressed about work and overreacted. We have to smooth this over, Valerie. I am not going to let you destroy the family dynamic over a stupid argument about rent." I looked at the man I had promised to spend the rest of my life with. I looked at the absolute lack of spine, the desperate need for approval from people who treated him like garbage, and the profound selfishness of his demands. I stood up slowly, picking up my purse from the desk. "I am not unpacking the bag, Derek," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of absolute finality. "And I am certainly not apologizing to a woman who physically assaulted me while my husband sat there and watched." Derek let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. It was just a slap. She was emotional. You provoked her by bringing up the mortgage in front of everyone. You know how sensitive Preston is about his finances." "His finances?" I repeated, the corners of my mouth twitching into a cold smile. "They are my finances, Derek. And as of tonight, I am permanently withdrawing my funding." I reached down to my left hand and took hold of my platinum wedding band. It slid off my finger easily. I walked over to the small coffee table in the center of the room and placed the ring gently on the glass surface. It made a quiet, sharp clinking sound. Derek stared at the ring, the color slowly draining from his flushed face as reality finally began to pierce through his alcohol-induced fog. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice suddenly losing its arrogant edge, replaced by a slight tremor of genuine panic. "I am leaving you, Derek," I said plainly. "I am leaving this guest house, I am leaving this family, and I am leaving this marriage. You chose your side at that dinner table tonight. I hope Preston and Cassandra make you very happy. You cannot just leave," he practically shouted, stepping toward me. "Where are you going to go? You cannot do this." "My lawyer will contact you on Monday morning," I replied, stepping around him smoothly. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and lifted my backpack onto my shoulder. "Valerie, stop," Derek pleaded, his panic escalating into desperation. "If you leave, Preston is going to charge me rent. I cannot afford to live here on my salary. What am I supposed to do?" Even in the very last moments of our marriage, his only concern was how my departure would financially inconvenience him. I opened the front door, feeling the cool night air rush in, washing away the smell of his wine and sweat. "I highly recommend you start packing too, Derek," I said without looking back. "Because Preston will not be living here much longer either." I walked out, pulling the door firmly shut behind me, severing the dead weight from my life forever. The drive away from the estate was the most peaceful experience I had felt in 4 entire years. I did not turn on the radio. I simply listened to the steady hum of my car's engine and the soft rush of the wind against the windows. Every mile I put between myself and that massive, fraudulent property felt like a heavy stone being lifted off my chest. I drove straight into the downtown district, about 45 minutes away from the suburbs, and pulled into the parking garage of a very nice, reputable corporate hotel. I walked into the bright, quiet lobby and booked a room for 7 nights. I did not use the joint credit card I shared with Derek. I used a completely separate travel rewards card that I had kept strictly in my name and paid off in full every month. When I finally reached my room on the 12th floor, I locked the deadbolt, fastened the security chain, and collapsed backward onto the massive, comfortable bed. For the first time since I co-signed that disastrous mortgage, I fell asleep instantly, completely free of the gnawing anxiety that usually kept me awake until dawn. I woke up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. The sun was pouring through the large windows, illuminating the pristine white sheets and the quiet luxury of the hotel room. I ordered a large pot of black coffee from room service, opened my laptop on the small desk by the window, and went straight to work. It was time to execute the financial strike. I logged into the primary banking portal, where all the family accounts were linked. My first target was the joint checking account I shared with Derek. It contained $4,200. Because my name was on the account as a primary holder, I had the legal right to withdraw the funds. I transferred exactly $2,100, exactly half the balance, into my newly created, secure individual account at a completely different banking institution. I left Derek his half. I was seeking justice, not petty theft. Next, I moved to the main event. The massive checking account that acted as the lifeblood for Preston and Cassandra's entire existence. Because the mortgage was legally tied to me and the account was opened using my credentials to facilitate the payments, I had full administrative control. I transferred the entire $22,000 balance out of that account and directly into my secure individual holding account. That money was from my paychecks, deposited over months to build a buffer for their property taxes. It belonged to me. Then came the most critical, devastating step of the entire operation. I navigated to the automated payments section of the banking portal. There were dozens of scheduled transfers set up to keep the illusion alive. I found the autodraft for the primary mortgage payment. I clicked delete. I found the autodraft for the homeowner's insurance policy. I clicked delete. I found the autodrafts for the local property taxes, the massive utility bills for the estate, and the monthly maintenance fee for the custom infinity pool. Delete. 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 With a few simple clicks of a mouse, I systematically severed every single financial artery keeping Preston's life on life support. I sat back in my chair and took a long sip of my hot coffee. I knew exactly what the consequences of my actions would be, not just for them, but for me. By intentionally defaulting on a mortgage that had my name on it as a cosigner, my flawless, hard-earned credit score was going to take a massive, catastrophic hit. It would drop by hundreds of points. It would take me years of careful financial management to rebuild it to where it was yesterday. Most accountants would consider this a completely irrational, self-destructive move. But as I looked out the hotel window at the city skyline, I realized that my perfect credit score had never actually benefited me. It had only been a tool used by my family to chain me to a wall of debt. My excellent credit was the very cage that kept me trapped. By destroying it, I was destroying the only leverage they had over me. I was burning the bridge, but I was doing it while I was already standing safely on the other side, watching them panic on the burning wood. I closed my laptop, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. The trap was set, the safety net was completely removed, and gravity was about to do the rest of the work. The weekend passed in absolute, blissful silence. I spent my time looking at apartment listings, buying a few new items of clothing, and enjoying the simple pleasure of not being yelled at. But I knew the silence was only temporary. I knew exactly how the banking system worked, and I knew that Monday morning would bring the storm. At exactly 9:15 on Monday morning, my phone screen lit up with a text message from Preston. It was casual, almost arrogant in its tone, completely ignoring the events of Friday night. The text read, "Hey, the bank just sent me an alert that the auto draft for the mortgage bounced. Looks like you forgot to move funds around. Fix it before they charge a late fee." He genuinely believed that my departure was just a temper tantrum and that I would dutifully return to my role as the family ATM after a weekend of pouting. I did not reply. I simply swiped the notification away and went back to reviewing a client's tax file. By Tuesday afternoon, the casual texts had turned into frantic phone calls. Preston called me 6 times in a row. Cassandra sent a barrage of unhinged text messages, her spelling deteriorating with every angry sentence. She called me a jealous, pathetic loser who was trying to ruin their lives because I could not find a real man. She threatened to sue me for emotional distress and claimed she was going to call my boss and get me fired. I took screenshots of every single message and saved them to a dedicated, encrypted folder on my cloud drive labeled Legal Evidence. By Wednesday, when the utility companies started sending automated notices about failed payments, the heavy artillery was called in. My parents, Barbara and Richard, the ultimate enablers, began their assault. They functioned like classic flying monkeys, dispatched by the golden child to retrieve the runaway scapegoat. My mother left 3 voicemails, each one escalating in dramatic intensity. In the first voicemail, she was crying softly, telling me how worried she was about my mental health and begging me to come home so we could pray together as a family. In the second voicemail, the tears were gone, replaced by sharp guilt tripping. She told me that I was breaking her heart and that a good daughter would never intentionally humiliate her brother in front of his important friends. My father's voicemails were entirely different. He did not use guilt. He used stern, authoritarian demands. He spoke to me as if I were a disobedient teenager rather than a 34-year-old professional woman. "Valerie, this has gone far enough," his recorded voice barked through my phone speaker. "You are acting incredibly immature. Preston has a lot of pressure on him right now, and you pulling this stunt is completely unacceptable. Turn the payments back on immediately, call Derek, and get back to the house. Do not make me come down to your office." Listening to his voice, I realized how deeply conditioned I had been to fear his disapproval. But sitting in my secure hotel room, holding the key to their financial survival, his threats sounded hollow and pathetic. I did not block their numbers. Blocking them would stop the flow of evidence. I simply muted the notifications and let every call go straight to voicemail, compiling a massive archive of harassment that my lawyer would find incredibly useful during the divorce proceedings. Speaking of the divorce, Derek finally sent me a long, rambling email on Thursday night. He did not apologize for his cowardice at the dinner table. Instead, he complained endlessly about his own victimhood. He wrote that Preston was in an absolute rage, tearing the main house apart looking for financial documents. He wrote that Preston had barged into the guest house, screaming at him and demanding that Derek pay the entire $12,500 rent immediately since I had abandoned my responsibilities. Derek begged me to transfer at least a few $1,000s so he could appease Preston and buy himself some time to figure things out. He actually typed the words, "You owe it to me as my wife to fix this mess you started." I printed a copy of that email, placed it in a crisp manila folder, and handed it to my divorce attorney the very next morning. The silence I maintained was a weapon far more devastating than any argument I could have had with them. They were shouting into a void, completely powerless, as the financial clock ticked down to 0. Week 3 arrived, and the catastrophic consequences of my financial withdrawal began to materialize with terrifying speed. If Preston had only owed money to a traditional bank, the foreclosure process would have been slow, taking months or even years to fully execute. But traditional banks do not lend money to people with Preston's credit history. Preston had funded his luxurious lifestyle using hard money lenders, private entities that charge exorbitant interest rates and operate with ruthless efficiency. They do not send polite warning letters, they send recovery agents. I received a detailed update from a mutual friend who lived in the same upscale neighborhood and loved to gossip. She called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice hushed with scandalous excitement. She told me that around 2 o'clock in the morning, a massive tow truck had backed into the circular driveway of the estate. 2 men had quickly hooked up Preston's gleaming silver sports car, the very car we were supposedly celebrating at the dinner party, and dragged it away into the darkness. Preston had run out onto the lawn in his pajamas, screaming and threatening to call the police, but the recovery agents simply handed him a clipboard with the default paperwork and drove off. Cassandra immediately went into damage control on her social media platforms. She posted a lengthy, overly emotional story claiming they had decided to voluntarily return the sports car because they were committing to a more eco-friendly, minimalist lifestyle. She disabled the comments on the post, but the humiliation was absolute. Everyone in our social circle knew exactly what a midnight repossession looked like. But the car was only the first domino to fall. By the end of the 3rd week, the utility companies lost their patience. Because the estate was massive, the monthly electricity and water bills were astronomical, and I was no longer auto-paying them. The friend reported that the beautiful custom infinity pool had turned a murky, swampy green because the filtration system had been shut off. The landscaping company, realizing they were not going to get paid, stopped coming. The perfectly manicured lawn began to overgrow, and the luxury facade of the property started to look abandoned. The pressure inside the house must have been completely unbearable, because Preston finally turned his rage onto the only target left, Derek. Derek sent me a pathetic, frantic email from his work computer. He wrote that Preston had physically thrown his belongings out onto the lawn. Preston had screamed at him, calling him a useless parasite, and told him that if he could not force his wife to pay the bills, he was no longer welcome on the property. Derek, having absolutely zero savings because he spent all his money trying to keep up with Preston's lifestyle, was forced to pack his bags into his mid-sized sedan. At 36 years old, my soon-to-be ex-husband had to drive across town and move back into his mother's spare bedroom. The supreme irony of the situation brought a genuine smile to my face. Derek had sacrificed our marriage to protect his status with Preston, and Preston had discarded him the absolute second he was no longer financially useful. Then, in the 4th week, the final, undeniable public execution took place. The primary mortgage lender, having received 0 communication and 0 funds for a full billing cycle, accelerated their timeline. A process server arrived at the estate in broad daylight. He did not just hand over the paperwork. He physically taped a massive, brightly colored notice of default directly onto the heavy wooden front doors of the house. It was a public declaration of financial failure, visible to every single neighbor walking their dogs or driving past the property. The illusion was completely, permanently dead. Cassandra's social media accounts went entirely dark. Not a single photo, not a single story. My parents stopped leaving angry voicemails and shifted to leaving desperate, sobbing pleas, realizing that their golden child was truly drowning and they did not have the life raft to save him. I watched all of this unfold from the quiet comfort of my new life, feeling no guilt, no remorse, and no desire to intervene. The ratchet effect had finally snapped backward, and it was crushing them under its weight. It was exactly 1 month, down to the very day, since the disastrous family dinner. I was sitting at the small dining table in my newly leased, one-bedroom apartment. It was a modest place, clean and quiet, with a beautiful view of a small community park. There was no infinity pool, no marble countertops, and no circular driveway. But the rent was paid by my own salary, the utilities were in my name, and the silence in the room belonged entirely to me. I was drinking a cup of chamomile tea and reviewing the initial draft of my divorce settlement when my cell phone vibrated on the table. The screen displayed an unknown, out-of-state number. Usually, I would let it go to voicemail, but a strange instinct told me to pick it up. I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said calmly. There was a heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a passing truck. "Valerie," a voice whispered. It took me a second to recognize it, because the arrogant, entitled tone was completely gone. It was Cassandra. Her voice was trembling, completely broken, lacking all the shrill confidence she usually projected to the world. "Valerie, please do not hang up," she begged, her voice cracking into a sob. "Please, I am begging you." I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my tea. I did not say a word. I simply listened. "We lost the house," she cried, the words tumbling out of her in a panicked rush. "The hard money lenders threatened to take Preston to court for fraud because of the collateral issues. We had to agree to a short sale just to keep him out of jail. We had to leave everything behind. We are staying in a cheap motel near the highway, and Preston will not get out of bed. He just stares at the wall. My credit cards are all frozen. I do not have money for food, Valerie. Please." She took a shuddering breath, sounding like a terrified child. "I am so sorry about the dinner. I am so sorry that I hit you. I was just so stressed, and I lost my mind. I know I was awful to you. But we are family. You cannot just leave us out here to die. Please, Valerie, unlock the accounts. Please help me. We have nowhere to go." I sat there in my quiet apartment, listening to the desperate sobbing of the woman who had treated me like a servant for 4 years. I thought about the thousands of hours I had worked to pay for her champagne and her designer shoes. I thought about the sting of her hand across my face and the cowardly silence of my husband. I thought about my parents, who were probably sitting in their own house, watching the golden child's empire crumble to dust. I felt a profound sense of closure. I did not feel the need to scream at her, to gloat, or to explain my reasoning. The math had already done all the explaining necessary. I lowered my teacup to the table, making a soft, clinking sound. I spoke into the phone, my voice perfectly steady, completely devoid of any anger or sympathy. "Cassandra," I said softly, ensuring she heard every single syllable clearly. "You reap what you sow." I did not wait for her response. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button to end the call, and immediately blocked the number. I blocked Preston's number, I blocked my parents' numbers, and I instructed my lawyer to handle all future communication with Derek. I walked over to the window, looking down at the small park where a group of kids were playing in the afternoon sun. The heavy chains of family loyalty, financial manipulation, and marital obligation had finally shattered completely. I was 34 years old, my credit score was a disaster, and I was going through a divorce. But as I stood there in the quiet sunlight, I had never felt wealthier in my entire life. They keep trying to reach me through mutual friends, claiming I destroyed our family over a simple misunderstanding and that I am cruel for abandoning them in their darkest hour. Am I wrong for walking away and letting them lose everything? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below to let me know your thoughts. See you in the next story.